a little bit more about the evaluation of a climate service, and that well, climate services generally, but with a little bit more of a focus on the trial climate services, as we've called them, that have been developed as part of SECLI-FIRM. As Claire said, I'm a consultancy manager at the Met Office, and as part of my role on SECLI-FIRM, I've been charged with the work package which oversees the development of these trial climate services. So led and some of the evaluation exercises that were designed to sort of assess kind of the performance of our trial climate services, and thinking about how they're being used by the end users involved in SECLI-FIRM, and particularly evaluating where there could be improvements. And towards the end of this talk, I will present that evaluation and hopefully show you that on the back of that evaluation, we made some meaningful improvements, which ensured that the trial climate services were properly aligned to what the end users wanted. So far, you've learnt about how to build a climate service. You've also learnt about seasonal forecasting and how to build skill into a usable service. And also you've heard a little bit about the business of climate services. Now it's time to think a little bit about what we're developing and how we can be sure that it is good, make sure that it is usable, and that it also has the potential to become a commercial service as well, because ultimately that's why a lot of services are produced. Not always. Some of them are built sort of more with sort of development, particularly support and development of other sort of Met services, other organisations in mind. But for many people, they will have a motivation of developing a service into something that is commercial. So this is where the subject of evaluation comes in. I'm going to be talking about evaluation, placing that in the context of the SECLI-FIRM project, which I've mentioned and you've heard lots about, and also more specifically, some of those case studies on SECLI-FIRM as well. A lot of what I present isn't particularly groundbreaking. It sits very much kind of sort of in the more social sciences rather than the kind of more physical and numerical sciences. But I think it's a crucially important step of climate service development, and I think too often we can probably get a bit wrapped up in the shiny science and lose track of exactly why we're building a climate service in the first instance. So we perhaps lose sight of the end user, for example, or our stakeholder and customer, depending on exactly how we phrase, how we term that end user. But ultimately, we're building a service for whoever that end user is. It's not for us. It's not for us to get wrapped up in the science, and to always be mindful of exactly what we're trying to achieve. So what is evaluation? Well, I think the dictionary definition is something along the lines of making a judgment about the amount, number, or value of something, making some kind of an assessment. I guess here in the context of climate services, we are mostly interested in the value of something and really ensuring that it is fit for purpose. So why is it important? Well, it's crucial that it's crucial in maximizing the potential of a service, ensuring resource is utilized appropriately, because otherwise resource could be wasted. You can imagine someone going off on a complete tangent and developing something that really isn't useful to the end user, and that's where effective and regular engagement is important as well. Evaluation is also important to ensure value for money. That's on both sides of the equation as well, the person developing it and also the person hopefully using it at the end. They don't want to see any resource wasted in the development of that, and ultimately, potentially, if it's a commercial service, pay more for that. And also, it's important to ensure that we're translating the cutting edge science to something that is actually usable as well. So you've learned about some of the seasonal forecast science that's going into these trial climate services. So we don't want to waste that. We want to make sure that it is usable. There isn't just one approach to evaluation. It should be modified to the type of service. That's particularly key here. So you'll learn later that in SECLI-FIRM, we gave a structured set of questions for people to ask, but within that there was some flexibility as well. We appreciated that there wasn't one size fits all. I guess if anything, within SECLI-FIRM we were a little bit more sort of constrained in the types of services we were developing. They were for two sectors only, water and energy, but if you moved outside that, you would probably want a little bit more flexibility in the type of evaluation you were developing and then presenting to your end user. And also picking the right evaluation is important as well. So I think key to this is ensuring that evaluation is timely, and that doesn't necessarily mean regular. So picking the right times for evaluation is important. I don't think you ever want to overburden, say, the end user if you're developing something with too much evaluation or too regular evaluation, because then it loses its impact, it becomes watered down. But ensuring that you present it at the right times, I think, ensures that it has the most impact. It's always important as well to have an idea of the sort of how skilled your kind of end user is, to have a clear idea of exactly how to present that evaluation, for example. So you might be working with a skilled user who understands kind of how a service is going to integrate with their processes, for example. I think in that instance, you probably want more kind of upfront evaluation and more during the development stage. You might be working working with a sort of less skilled user, and they might be wondering, what can you do for us? So in that situation, they might want to sit back a little bit more. You might want to present them with some ideas, perhaps a proof of concept, to first imagine what they could be getting before figuring out how best it could be used by them. So there's less kind of upfront evaluation there, more of that sits towards the sort of back end of the development. You present them with some ideas and they think about how they could use it. And in that process, they are getting skilled themselves and hopefully become more competent in asking the right questions, and ensuring that you're at that point co-developing something that is really useful for them. So thinking a little bit about the types of evaluation, there is a growing body of literature, the types of evaluation of climate services. Sorry, can you still hear?
Yes, I can hear you, Joe. Well, I could.
Okay, as long as you can stay me, I don't know.
Yeah, I can see you now. Yeah.
Is it like that you can't hear me, Claire?
I can see you, but the sound is maybe not as good.
Okay. I guess we'll continue.
So maybe try without the camera. Hi, Joe. Otherwise, maybe if you continue to have problems, maybe somebody can share your presentation, and if you just go next slide. I know that's not so easy, but yeah, we can't. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so I think your presentation's being.
So yeah, I'm on the slide. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm still on the slide with the post-it notes at the moment. Types of evaluation. Great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Apologies for that disruption. So yeah, there's a growing body of literature on the types of evaluation of climate services. They consider various aspects of evaluation from the different times it can be applied to the different aspects of a service that you might want to evaluate. The literature presented here is far from exhaustive, and I would encourage you to read the papers referenced here, as well as those papers referenced within the 3 papers that I reference here, particularly if you are interested or about to embark on some evaluation of a service, for example. Here I aim to keep things simple and just give you a high level kind of overview of some of the key principles of evaluation. So one of those 3 papers I mentioned is this paper by Schuck Zoller that talks about the different phases of research projects during which evaluation can take place. So it's fairly straightforward, as you'd imagine, but you can effectively undertake evaluation either before, during, or after a presentation. And I think a key to any evaluation, and this goes back somewhat to what we talked about in the previous slide, is that it is appropriate rather than good. So you could come up with some wonderful questionnaire, various forms of feedback, interactive polls, for example, but if it's not at the right time, if it's too advanced, asks too much of end users, it won't get the impact desired. So you don't want to waste your time, you don't want to waste the customer's time, for example. And I think when you present this evaluation, there has to be an obvious benefit for them as well. So you need to explain your rationale behind the evaluation when you present it. Next slide, please. Thinking a little bit more from a slightly different framing. So rather than the sort of timing of the intervention, rather than the timing of the evaluation, thinking about the different themes or categories of evaluation. And this was a slide that was presented in a different format by Claire in the talk that she gave on the 23rd of September, which first raised the idea of evaluation. And it thinks about some of the different types of evaluations. So there's evaluation of the outputs and outcomes. So that can be broken down into the sort of quality and or economics / practical value of a climate services. And thinking a bit about whether they are made better because of the engagement or co-production that has happened as well. So I think that's a key process as well, particularly perhaps during the development of a trial climate services. So asking whether there's actually a tangible, a noticeable improvement in the trial climate services because of the ongoing engagement and co-production. You can also evaluate the actual process of co-production as well. That could be useful, particularly in instances where perhaps you feel like it's not going as well as you could. So you could pause to kind of understand perhaps how that could be improved. It's also very useful at the end as well, so that both sides, so the person doing the developing and the end user, understands how they could improve that co-production moving forward. Evaluating the quality, effectiveness of stakeholder engagement is another option, and also developing and sustaining communities of practice. That can be particularly useful for getting different insights into the development of a climate service. Next slide, please. Here's another kind of slightly different framing for evaluation as well. So this is a paper from Vaughan and SI in 2014, which, as I said, frames it in a slightly different way, but with essentially quite a lot of overlap and the same ideas. So they talk about elements of a climate service evaluation framework, one being the problem identification and the decision-making context. So that's kind of understanding how the service that you're developing can sort of integrate with the end user's kind of decision making, which is a key process that we highlighted in SECLI-FIRM and through the decision trees, which I think you've heard about as well. And we did various exercises ensuring that the decision trees were sort of mapping onto the exact visualizations we were developing and proposing in the trial climate services. So we also thought about the characteristics, tailoring and dissemination. Another type of evaluation is thinking about the characteristics, tailoring and dissemination of the climate information. The governance and structure of the service is also important, including the processes by which it is developed, and also the socio-economic value of the service. So we've already mentioned that the economic value is important, and that could be particularly crucial if you're trying to encourage a prospective user, for example, on the value of a service to their organization. So obviously it requires a kind of structured way of actually measuring and valuing the economic value of a service. But once you have that, it can be a useful tool for encouraging uptake of that service. Next slide, please. So we thought a bit about some of the theory behind evaluation, but it's now time to put this into a SECLI-FIRM context. And as you will have already heard, SECLI-FIRM has been designed around 9 case studies. There's a nice infographic in the top right of this slide. And from these, a number of trial climate services have been designed. I've been talking a little bit about trial climate services. That was the term that we deliberately chose in SECLI-FIRM to really give the impression that this was like a prototype development, and there wasn't an expectation as such that these would become operational within the timescales of SECLI-FIRM. But through having a trial, we hope to really develop something that was useful and to elongate that development process to make sure that we didn't rush into something that we became operational before it was appropriate for it to become operational. For example, we wanted to ensure that that co-development process, some of the iterative processes that we went through to improve the service were really sort of developed, and there was enough time to perform those exercises. So the first case study, Trial Climate Services, went live in the autumn of 2020. And at that time, we identified a number of delivery methods associated with each trial climate service. And that is shown in the table in the bottom right of this plot. And you can see there's common delivery methods across the case study. So a trial climate service wasn't developed for each of these case studies, but a number of trial climate services were developed, and they all had some common delivery methods. For example, they all used post-processed forecast data, and that was from that we derived sort of relevant indicators that were of interest to the end users for them to then make decisions from. Pretty much all of the trial climate services had some element of visualization in mind, with the exception of one, which was developed in line with case study 8, which was more the provision of data, and that was chosen as such because the end user in that instance didn't want some visualization. They wanted data that could fit in very much within their existing systems, so they knew what they wanted and how we could give them information that they could integrate easily. So in that instance, the trial climate service was developed to deliver that data to fit into their existing processes. So you can see, like, not one size fits all, and we had a good range of trial climate services and delivery methods across those developed within SECLI-FIRM. And this actual development and of the trial climate services followed the science and applied science work packages, which you've learned a little bit about in the previous week. So there was some good new science that went into this. And since the sort of start of the trial climate services, they've been developed further in real time. As I mentioned earlier, there's been a real kind of iterative process to this, whereby you test something, it perhaps might not work as well as hoped. You go back to the drawing board, you then present it to the end user, and you often repeat on this cycle until you kind of iterate towards a trial climate service that best meets the end user's needs. Next slide, please. So what actually happened in practice? So this gives you an idea of some of the sort of integrated evaluation, or rather more informal feedback that went on through the co-development of the trial climate service. So on this slide, you can see an example of 2 work plans that were developed for 2 trial climate services. And as I said, these kind of give examples of intermediate evaluation or feedback. And on the top right here, we have one trial climate service and a kind of work plan over the next 12 or so months. And you can see there's a number of tasks there, but a number of them orientate around some form of valuation. So for example, there was a series of workshops with the end user in this instance to ensure that user has confidence in their ability to integrate the tool into decision processes. And there's also then a period of systematic and detailed evaluation as well that happened towards the start of this year, which following that more kind of informal intermediate feedback allowed us to kind of assess exactly in a more formal way exactly how the trial climate services were being used, and then to identify key improvements and important improvements that needed to be made over the final months of the SECLI-FIRM project to ensure that we had as good and viable service as we could possibly develop by the end of the trial climate service. And the bottom left-hand table here, that shows a work plan for another trial climate service, and you have similar kind of interventions along the way there. So user workshops to sit down with the end user to evaluate how the outcomes and outputs as they exist at that time are being used and whether there could be any improvements. And then also a period of kind of more systematic and formal evaluation to kind of understand exactly what improvements could be made between the start of this year and roughly about now as we come towards the end of SECLI-FIRM. And there's a little note here just around the importance of regular and timely feedback, and that was identified, planned and implemented via these work plans as well. So evaluation was a key part of the work plan cycle. Next slide, please. And this is just another example which looks at various steps in the user engagement process. So this is quite a detailed work plan that came from another of the trial climate services. In this instance, it was a trial climate service with Met Office developing it, and with Shell being the end user. And I think this was a particularly good example of really good user engagement along the way. But you can see here there was an identification from quite an early stage with a good lead time of the importance of weekly meetings between, in this case, Met Office and Shell, to ensure that the trial climate service was being constantly reviewed as well. So this is that more kind of intermediate, ongoing, somewhat informal evaluation, which is important. And as a consortium, as a SECLI-FIRM consortium, we talked about this openly as well. So there was a, we obviously had that benefit of sort of different insights from lots of different expertise within the consortium on SECLI-FIRM, and we wanted to talk about that openly to ensure that trial climate services were learning from other trial climate services, and organisations were learning from other organisations, and we were sharing some of our experiences and best practices as well, and sort of being open in that iterative process and talking about how we were getting there. So it wasn't always that we would make an adjustment or tweak the trial climate service for the better. Sometimes things wouldn't work and the end user would give some feedback that actually this visualization, this way of looking at it, is more difficult than the previous visualization, for example. And we'd be open in talking about that. And in some instances where there were some similarities between trial climate services, that information then benefited the other trial climate services, and they realized that there were some decisions that probably weren't for the better, for example. Next slide, please. So thinking a little bit more about intermediate evaluation, this slide considers the outcome of some of that. This is, again, as to reiterate, evaluation that is very much ongoing while the trial climate services were being developed. And in some ways, given its informal nature, it probably more sort of falls towards the category of feedback. But in this slide here, we're looking at some evidence that comes directly from one of the series of workshops run on one of the trial climate services. And in this instance, the end user was Thames Water. And this has also been developed by the organisation I work for, the Met Office. And some of these workshops, I think, were really beneficial for just essentially getting feedback on particularly some of the visualizations that were being developed, and there was some quite strong feedback on some of them. Some of the visualizations that we as an organization came up with weren't appropriate for use of the Thames Water. So for example, you can see this top left-hand plot, there were some wide uncertainty bands there, which in Thames Water's perspective made it difficult to make decisions at longer lead times, because at longer lead times your uncertainty in the forecast increases, and there was some difficulty from some users within Thames Water of how to interpret that information. So we then tried a different sort of threshold approach, which turns that probabilistic information into more of a binary decision-making process. But there was still some difficulty there in deciding on exactly how to translate that into risk for Thames Water. So this then iterated into a red, amber, green, or red status, which is shown by this bar here, which was shown as deemed kind of more appropriate by Thames Water and a little bit easier to kind of identify and flag severe events that might be coming up in the next couple of weeks. And but it was also deemed useful to kind of understand, well, what is this relative to? Because in this instance we were forecasting water demand, and that changes throughout the year, so it was good to get an impression of what your kind of baseline is, what your climatology is. So it was also proposed that we present a kind of a parallel or kind of supporting kind of visualization that showed this information, so that Thames Water kind of understood what their baseline was, what they were comparing to, and this was deemed like a really useful visualization in the forecast for them. Next slide, please. And this just presents, again, the same sort of visualization, but for a different forecast period, and just highlights one other bit of visualization one other bit of feedback that came from Thames Water, which was useful. So with regards to this particular visualization and how the forecast information is presented, it gave Thames Water confidence to start earlier preparation for a peak demand event, and they actually took some actions on the back of that to manage and monitor the situation. So with this type of visualization and following that kind of intermediate evaluation and feedback that we had, we were able to come up with a trial climate service, particularly a visualization that worked best for Thames Water, and they felt they were able to make concrete decisions on the back of as well. So distilling some quite complex forecast information into some very specific but quite specific visualizations, and that was a really nice process we went on with some important evaluation along the way to get to an ideal endpoint. Next slide, please. So what was exactly evaluated in SECLI-FIRM? So most of what I've been talked about so far was kind of more ad hoc evaluation. And as I said, that was a really important process. We talked about it openly in our catch-ups to ensure that sort of best practice and was being learnt and shared across the SECLI-FIRM consortium. But there's also a need for kind of more important or more kind of structured evaluation as well, which we undertook at the start of this year. And we decided that it's really important to, going back to those types of evaluation, to distinguish between evaluation of the actual process of co-development of the trial climate services, for example, the quality and effectiveness of the stakeholder engagement and relationship building, and also to distinguish between that and the evaluation of the outputs and outcomes as well. And it was actually this latter point that we focused on most, the quality of the data information generated, and also the ability to narrow the usability gap as well. So how was that forecast information, how was the trial climate service being used by the end user? And that was something we really wanted to narrow in on a little bit more and properly understand. We also wanted to reiterate this point that there is it's probably important not to overburden industry partners with too much evaluation and actually distract from the co-production and co-development of the service as well. So it was obviously important to develop a useful service and to concentrate some efforts on that, but not to give them too much evaluation, not to request too much feedback from them, because it could distract from the important task of actually iterating towards an ideal and a usable trial climate service. So that led us towards coming up with a short user survey, which we decided would refocus the co-production of the trial climate services at an important part, important sort of time in the co-development of the trial climate services at the start of this year, at a time when we still had 6 to 9 months of the trial climate service to go, which gave us enough time to make some improvements on the back of that trial climate service. Next slide, please. So as already alluded to, we're thinking a little bit more about the outputs and outcomes, but what particularly kind of within that are we thinking about? So this slide represents a couple of the visualizations that came up with the trial climate services and have been given to the end users to make decisions from and to make informed decisions from. But what particular component of that is important to understand? And in the top right hand plot here, you can see, sorry, top right hand panel here, you can see we went back to thinking a little bit about the types of evaluation. And if you can go to the next slide, please. As I alluded to, we are thinking about the outputs and outcomes, but within that, we're really thinking about the quality and the practical value of the trial climate services. So exactly how they're going to be used. What we don't think about is the economic evaluation that was considered and evaluated through a separate task. But here we were really thinking about the actual quality and usability of the trial climate services and what future potential it had. Next slide, please. So what did we come up with? This slide shows a screenshot of the evaluation that was presented to end users. And it might look quite simple, but we did think quite carefully about how to present this. And we thought it was important to begin the evaluation by presenting a purpose so that people on both sides of the sort of developer end user dynamic were clear on the purpose of the evaluation. So in terms of the purpose, we described that it was intended to foster further dialogue between case study partners and serve as an informal reflection on the status of the service as of March of this year. And we also thought it's important to stress exactly what we weren't evaluating. So we wanted to separate the usability, the visualization that was developed within the trial climate services from the actual skill. So skill can be difficult in the types of services that we're developing. We know that skill out beyond 2-3 weeks is difficult. And in some instances, skill was a bit of a stumbling block. But if we strip that skill aside to one side, the visualizations in themselves, kind of how easy are they to interpret, and how good are these trial climate services at supporting decision making on the side of the end users, for example. So we're mostly concerned about the usability of the service independent of that skill. So this is what the end users saw when they got the evaluation exercise in March of this year. Next slide, please. And we consider it important to frame the evaluation around 5 key themes. And these themes were visualization, which I mentioned multiple times, usability, user needs, ensuring that the services are actually aligned to what the end users need, the actual development process. So we touched a little bit there on the sort of engagement and co-development of the trial climate services and how that was working, and also future use as well. This is important for understanding the sort of steps that we needed to take to ensure that we could make as many improvements as we could between the time of this evaluation, which, as I said, was March of this year, and now the sort of final month or so of the SECLI-FIRM project. We used a number of techniques for this, using sort of the Likert scale to ensure that it was framed around, it used best kind of sort of social science practice in getting useful feedback and comments on some of the questions that we were raising. And then just to give you an example of some of the questions that we asked and the options that people had to answer those. So one of the questions around visualization was simply around the color and layouts of the information and whether that made the interpretation of the forecast information easy. This is one of the most important things in a trial climate service, just ensuring that something is visually appealing and easy to interpret and make decisions from. Next slide, please. So around the usability, we ask questions such as how easy is it to interpret the forecasts as they are currently provided. So this thought a little bit more about whether the actual information that was being provided had been distilled enough to ensure that it matched the skill of the end user, for example. So if there's still some complex information in there, it wasn't going to be easy for them to make decisions from. Next slide. Around user needs, we asked them on a scale of 1 to 10. Sorry, can you just go back one slide, please? Back a slide. And one more. Thank you. So user needs on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is not small, 10 is perfectly. How well do you feel your needs have been understood in the development of the service? So this did reflect a little bit more on the co-development of the service and ensuring that the end users felt listened to as well. And for example, if we found that they weren't being listened to, we could perhaps remedy that through having more regular catch-ups and more kind of structured engagement events. And onto the next slide, please, around development. When you use the service at the moment, what's it missing? This was a really key question for identifying some of those key things that we could develop over the final 6 months of the project that would really help the end users use that trial climate service and use it meaningfully in their decision making as well. And onto the next slide, please, just to give you an example of some of the feedback we got. What would need to improve for you to continue using a support service indefinitely? So this was a really important question as well, just to understand what we needed to tackle in those final few months. And we got quite a bit of feedback around sort of when asking these questions that some of these services needed a little bit more expert support. So they couldn't necessarily act as standalone services. It would be useful sometimes to talk to an expert, perhaps an operational meteorologist who was looking at this forecast from day to day and how it might have evolved, to really understand kind of how best to kind of act on the forecast information that they were getting. Another sort of theme that came out of this as well was that training is sometimes required to be able to interpret the report and the information that they were getting. So while the visualization in itself might have been stripped down to be as simple and as accessible as possible, some level of training is still useful, particularly for elements of an end user's organization that might be less skilled in the interpretation of forecast information. Next slide, please. So on the back of this feedback, we targeted a few improvements. It was clear that there were some of these services needed expert support, and some of the ideas we got for how this expert support could kind of exist were around sort of daily briefings, ad hoc teleconferences, phone a forecaster, for example, or some kind of structured training. So going into the end user's organization and giving them some formal training on how to interpret the information that is being provided. So around things like ad hoc teleconferences, for example, some of the trial climate studies have played around with this and trialed it, particularly to support some key sort of forecast windows where there are some big operations happening, for example. And it worked quite well in a trial climate setup, but we recognize that it might not work in reality. Like, whose responsibility is it to set up that teleconference? How regular should it be? And is it something that you can really sort of, if it does become a commercial service, is something that you can really cost, for example, and would it actually be appropriate to do so where there might be periods where you don't need that forecaster, for example, or periods when you do need much more interaction. So this is something that we've been looking at a little bit more, and actually a colleague of mine at the Met Office has been doing a lot of work into this to understand how best we can sort of supplement the forecast information that we are providing with sort of external expert skill from other areas from within the Met Office. So using some of our operational meteorologists, for example, to support the trial climate services. And this just gives a little bit of feedback on that slide as you flick through it. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. And on to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. This development enabled us to come up with new look services. So we made some changes to the visualization across these services to enable integration and alignment of multiple useful plots. So we kind of in some ways stripped it down and just focused on the plots that were identified as being most useful. And as I mentioned, that specific exercise that my colleague has been undertaking has trialed several modes of support and is currently being written up for the final deliverables in SECLI-FIRM. If you could just flick on one more, please. There's a comment, speech bubble in the top right-hand corner. Okay, sorry. Yes. And then, as I said, testing and evaluating these modes of support is ultimately key for the uptake of commercial services. So that's kind of where we are at the moment, understanding exactly how that support might work and how it works kind of in a trial setup and how it might look as we move forward. And this bottom left-hand table here just revisits the delivery methods, and you can see for case study 9, which was the Thames Water case study, we've added as a potential delivery method a teleconference or webinar to enable a bit more information, a bit more expert insight into various forecasts, and also this possibility of a briefing document as well. So that sits beside a teleconference as being a potentially useful tool to supplement the forecast information. Next slide, please. So that final evaluation exercise is currently ongoing. So we had one iteration 6 months ago. We're currently revisiting that. And as I said, that's really important to chart progress over the final months of SECLI-FIRM. It leads to greater accountability. It shows that some of the comments of the end user have been acted on and that the developer is taking these seriously and making sure that the service is meeting the requirements of the end user. It also maximizes the likelihood of uptake of the services beyond the end of SECLI-FIRM as well, which is a real hope of us on the SECLI-FIRM consortium that some of these trial climate services do get used beyond the conclusion of the project. And it's important to just reiterate that evaluation should be a continual process in the life cycle of a healthy climate service. So we hope that if they do get taken forward some of these services, that the evaluation doesn't stop there. So next slide and final slide, just in summary. We talked a little bit about the motivation behind some evaluation and why it is important. Remember, one of the key aspects there was around it being sort of timely, so not overburdening end users with it, and also making sure it is appropriate rather than good. So not just doing it for the sake of it, but making sure it's aligned to a specific purpose to understand how the end users are using your information and interpreting it. For example, we learned about types of evaluation. I talked for a few papers that present different types of evaluation and different ways of thinking about that. We thought about evaluation in a SECLI-FIRM context. So talked quite a lot about informal sort of approaches and how that was embedded into our work plans and into the co-development and engagement with end users, and also some more structured approaches as well, such as that survey. And also we talked a little bit about acting on that evaluation. So I talked about the last 6 months and some of those steps that have been taken to lead us towards more optimum services and services that may hopefully get taken up beyond SECLI-FIRM itself. Okay, I think that's my final slide. There are some references on the next one, but thank you for listening. And I think I'm open for questions.
Many thanks, Dave, for a really nice presentation on the theory and practice, the evaluation of climate services, and a round of virtual applause. So I've got some questions here ready for you. The first two, I think, are sort of related, so I'll ask them together. Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes for questions. So the first one is from Kristen. And I know you said skill is difficult, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. What do you do when the client doesn't like your forecast for one event? How do you help them understand that on average, the forecast is skillful? And then a kind of related question from Henry: how do you communicate your forecast to customers in cases where you have huge differences in percentiles and forecast probabilities? So I guess that's talking about a very divergent forecast.
Yeah, it's both good questions. I think we did have a range of kind of skill, I think, amongst our end users across the project. I think if anything, they were a little bit more weighted towards kind of more skilled users actually, compared to perhaps your average kind of end user for climate services here. So they don't like the forecast for one event. I think we somewhat avoided that through being very upfront in the science that had gone into it and the bounds of where skill took us in terms of number of days, a timely number of days, for example, or perhaps if you're looking at a true seasonal forecast, you know, the extent to which that could go to. So you're looking at shifts towards warmer than average, cooler than average, wetter than average, drier than average, for example. So in our instance, we haven't had any issues with a client not liking one event or not liking the forecast for one event. But we, I think, avoided that by going to your second point there, Christian, by communicating up front that on average, if you use the forecast in a consistent way, that as long as you have some skill and base your decisions around that in a consistent way, then you should see some benefit from that as well. So we did some work around cost loss, for example, and presented this in a more quantitative way, but it's also done more qualitatively as well to ensure that they understood that there should be some value in that forecast if you use it in a consistent way and understand the constraints within that as well. So there are issues with skill beyond a certain time period, and we wouldn't suggest that you make decisions on the back of that. So that open dialogue ensured that we avoided such situations like that, at least in this project, but I'm sure it does happen elsewhere.
Okay. And one more question and a quick answer if you can. So this question is from Lena. What underlying assumptions do you make during the assessment development process? Is a pre-evaluation of the client knowledge taken into consideration?
Yes. So I think within that there weren't assumptions, I don't think, as such, because we were informed, but I think we very much built into that the level of engagement we'd had with the end users. So our engagement was quite developed, it was quite advanced, so we asked them some quite tough questions because we knew that they, in most instances, were using that forecast information. But I guess that was an assumption that we made, that they were using it kind of actively and quite engaged in the process. So we could ask some quite tough, quite structured questions, but that might not have been appropriate. I think it assumed that they were very involved in it. If they weren't very involved in the development and they weren't truly co-developing that service, then I think we would want to ask very different questions there. So yeah, that's where sort of stripping back or standing back and thinking about the client sort of knowledge and where they sit and how involved in the process they are would be important. I think you would then need to adjust that evaluation accordingly.